Morning. As we celebrate our communion, what a special time this is. This ordinance, this statue that Jesus set up for every one of us. Now we're looking at a fresh look at the Sabbath part 4. We started in Luke chapter 4 where Jesus read a passage from Isaiah revealing that he came to do what? He came to preach to the poor. He came to set the captives free, to unburden those who are burdened, and also to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. And what we discovered is that Jesus does all these things that he read in Luke, he does them on the Sabbath. Giving us a fresh look at Sabbath. Sabbath is not just about rules and regulations. Sabbath is about healing. Sabbath is about restoration. Sabbath is about understanding what God does for us. And then we went back into the Israelites' journey from Egypt and out of Egypt. We looked at how what God was doing for the Israelites in Egypt was the same as what Jesus does on the Sabbath in Luke. That's really interesting when we look at it like that. And what we find that God is doing the same thing for the Israelites leading up to the Sabbath. When God instigated the Sabbath, reminded them about the Sabbath, he did it before the commandments were given. At Exodus chapter 16. Today we're going to look at a passage at the end of Exodus 15, which is going to connect to Sabbath, but it's also going to connect to communion. Now, for people who think that I might have planned this series and planned this to be on this date, I wasn't that clever, but it's amazing how God has brought it together that we can talk about this passage while we have communion and we still get a fresh look at the Sabbath. So we're going to look at where Jesus or God turns the bitter water into sweet water. Now we remember a couple of weeks ago we talked about the Israelites coming out of Egypt, and in their journey coming out of Egypt they were coming out to serve God, but how they turned and decided they'd rather serve Pharaoh. And what was the main difference? Why did they choose Pharaoh over God? Because that's what they knew. That's all they knew, and they didn't know about God. And with God, they had to do something that they weren't familiar with. They had to just trust. They didn't have to fight. They didn't have to work. They didn't have to do anything other than trust. And it was trust that they actually struggled with. And so when things got tight, when they were taken from Egypt, we had some mountains on this side, we had the sea on this side, and on this side we had the Egyptian army coming towards them, and they thought they were doomed. But all God wanted was to teach them about trust. And we saw that God opened up the Red Sea, took them through and destroyed their enemies. And chapter 15 is amazing. If you get a chance, have a look at it this week, because chapter 15 is a song that they sang about their deliverance. And we find that from that point of time, they were in a really good place. They feared God. They followed him. They were so excited. And today we start that they took a 3-day journey. Now, as we look at this passage, I want you to do something significant. I want you to actually look and see if you see any similarities in this passage to what we're doing here today. So open your Bibles with me to Exodus chapter 15. Exodus chapter 15. And we're going to start in verse 22. Exodus chapter 15. And we're going to start in verse 22. 2. Exodus 15 and verse 22, and it says, So Moses brought Israel from the Red Sea. Then they went into the wilderness of Shur, and they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. Now when they came to Marah, they could not drink the waters of Marah, for they were bitter. Therefore the name of it was called Marah. And in verse 24 it tells us that the people complained against Moses, saying, What shall we drink? What shall we drink? I want us to try and put ourselves in the space of what's actually happening here. I want us to try and, if we can, imagine that we're there. That we've just seen the Red Sea close in on the Egyptians. We've seen that army completely destroyed, and we experience that now we have freedom with God. Can you place yourself in that scene? And then we start a journey, and we find that it's a 3-day journey. We already found from chapter 5 that they were to go on a 3-day journey to do what? To make sacrifices to God. So this 3-day journey was going to come to a point where there's going to be a special sacrifice or a special communion or a special thing that we haven't seen what it is yet, but we're going to see what it is. So they're taking this journey, and as they leave the Red Sea and they get further away from the sea, they notice that the area around gets drier and drier. There's mountains and there's hills, there's this wilderness area, and it's not real comfortable. And as they're looking at their water supplies are starting to run down, and they go from day 1 into day 2. And from day 2 they go into day 3, and by this time they have no water left. And they're famished. Now I want you to also think about Moses, because Moses actually knew this region. Moses actually knew that where the cloud was taking the Israelite nation was to this place, Marah. This place, Marah, which meant bitter. Why was it called bitter? Because the water there was bitter. And I can just imagine Moses as the cloud's heading towards this area and the people are murmuring about the lack of water, that he's going, oh no, it's not going to be good when it gets here. Things are not going to be pretty. And when they saw in the distance, they saw this shimmering water. They go, water! Water! And it flowed back through the people, and the people got excited, and the first ones that got down there to have a drink, and they tasted the water, and it was bitter. Whoa. Imagine. Now it starts to go back through the rest of the crowd, and they go, the water's bitter, it's no good. It's terrible. What has Moses done to us? And they complained to Moses. By the way, what should they have done? What should they have done? They complained to Moses, saying, what shall we drink? So what did Moses do? What Moses did, they should have been doing. Because what Moses did, he says he cried out to the Lord, and he showed him a tree. Hey, how many people have got tree in their version? Who's got something else? Call it out. Wood? Anything different? No? Okay, we'll talk about that shortly. But here he showed him a tree, and when he cast it into the waters became sweet. Simple thing, hey? I don't know how much water was there, but for that to happen so quickly, it's miraculous. You know, there were things that could make things sweet, but there was no tree that grew in this vicinity that could do what that actually happened on that day. And so this tree or this wood, and the Greek word for this tree or wood is actually attis. Attis. And it's interesting, I looked at this word attis and I looked back and I noticed that attis starts right in the very beginning. that God created an attis to produce fruit. And then we saw about this attis was also the attis of life, the tree of life. And we see that this word attis can actually be translated into wood, into a tree, or into even a gallows. We have that same word attis used for the gallows that Haman built for Mordecai. A place of death. This word attis is also used for wood that was put on the altar, and then the sacrifice was put on the wood. By the way, have you seen any similarities from this passage yet to here, what we're doing today? How many days' journey did they take? 3 days' journey. How long was Jesus in the tomb? 3 days is a really significant date in the Bible, and it often says 3 days, and we don't know why 3 days, but we see 3 days takes us into a lot of different places. So here it tells us that when he cast in this tree, that the waters became sweet. And then it tells us that there he made a statue and an ordinance for them, and there he tested them. What was their test? Their test was to know whether they would actually trust him. I want you to ask yourself the question in your life. As you've journeyed through life and you've come through bitter and difficult times, how often, when things get hard, do you turn away from God instead of turning to God? How often do you trust that he's got things sorted out in your future, or are you trying to work out your own future? You know, they don't have to do this work to sort themselves out. Jesus would have supplied for them, but they just couldn't see it. And as soon as things didn't work out, they've lost that trust, and they complained to Moses. But Moses was shown a tree. It was interesting that that was actually done. That wood that was placed in the water. You know, often we look at stories in the Bible just as stories in the Bible. And we miss the significance of what they were saying. I remember studying with this lady, and she was quite a bright, probably a lot brighter than what I was. And I tried to share with her one day about a story in the Bible and it having another meaning. And she said, no, they're just stories. And I remember her coming back the next week. She'd actually looked at a couple of those stories that we talked about, and she'd come back and she said, yeah, there's so much more than stories, aren't they? And we see so God, in every one of their situations, as he was leading them to the promised land, he was trying to get them to trust him. He was trying to build their faith and trust in him. And so he leads them on this way that Moses is sort of going, Lord, I don't know what you're doing here, because I know that water's bitter and these guys are thirsty. But he wanted to set up an ordinance there. He wanted to set up something for them to say, hey, I will look after you. I will care for you. I will supply your needs. You don't have to work to get it and sort it out for yourself. You just got to trust. You've got to trust. As we read on, we find in verse 26, and he said, if you will diligently heed my voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his sight, give ear to his commandments. Give ear, listen to it in other words, and keep all his statutes. I will put none of the diseases on you which I have brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who does what? Who heals. What did we say happened on the Sabbath in Jesus, reading in Luke from Isaiah? One of the things was that he would heal the brokenhearted. Here we find God doing the same for the Israelites. He wanted them to follow his way so he could heal them. He could heal them. I'll put none of the diseases on you. You know, the Egyptians had a number of diseases. They also had these healers in this place that were supposed to bring healing for them, but it never really happened the way they claimed that they could do. But God was actually saying, just trust me, I will bring healing for you. Then we find, then they went from Elim, where there were 12 wells of water and 70 palm trees. So they camped there by the waters. Wow. First, he led them to a place that wasn't comfortable, where they had to let go of themselves and their own concerns and their worries and call out to God. And Moses was the only one that did it. But he heard Moses cry. And he said, I want you to take a piece of wood and I want you to put it in the waters. And then the waters became sweet. This bitter water becomes sweet. You seeing any similarities to the communion today? No shaking the heads. Are you seeing any similarities to the communions? Some, yeah. But I love how from there, God took them to a place where there was 12 springs. What's the significance of 12? 12 tribes of Israel. 12 springs of water. What's the 70? They were later to have 70 leaders over them. 70 palm branches to shade them from the heat of the desert and to keep them cool and to keep them in this place together to worship God. To understand that He is the one who supplies our every need. We don't have to stress and be worried. We just need to go to God and to call out to Him. So what's the significance of this passage? Well, we find it's an ordinance. But we don't really talk about the ordinance. But we noticed a few things here, didn't we? We noticed that it was 3 days, a 3-day journey. We noticed that there was bitter water that was made sweet. And we noticed that there was a tree. And we saw how this tree represents many things. It could represent the tree of life. It could represent the same wood that's on the sacrifice. That it could represent a place where someone dies, like the gallows. When that tree was put in the water, that's when the waters become sweet. I want us to turn over to John chapter 19. Yeah, the amazing thing, I've been reading through the Gospels this year. And yesterday I got up to John chapter 19. And it was where I wanted to go anyway, but it was interesting that in my own personal study I got up to John 19 in this time. John chapter 19, and I want us to have a look at verse 28. John chapter 19 and verse 28, and it says, After this, Jesus, knowing that all things were accomplished, that the scriptures might be fulfilled, said, what? I thirst. I thirst. Jesus was thirsty. It had been a very difficult time for him leading up to this point, and he was thirsty, and he knew that he was going to say that anyway because of what was prophesied in the Old Testament about him. And he said, I thirst. Did he have sweet water? Let's read on. Now there was a vessel full of sour wine was sitting there, and they filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on hyssop, in other words, a bit of wood or a tree or a plant. He put it on hyssop and he put it to his mouth. So when Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, It is finished. And bowing his head, he gave up his spirit. What day was that? It tells us Therefore, because it was the preparation day, the body should not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for the Sabbath was a high day. We're going to see in a couple of weeks' time that Exodus 15 goes to Exodus 16, which talks about the Sabbath. Here Jesus has done this on the preparation day before the Sabbath. And it's verse 33 says, but when they came to Jesus, they were breaking the legs of the soldiers on either side, and they came to do that to Jesus to make sure that he died so they could take the bodies off the cross on the Sabbath, because the Sabbath was a high day. It was the Passover. They had just experienced the Passover when they came out of Egypt. And now we find in verse 34, but one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water came out. Blood and water came out. And it tells us after this that those who saw it believed from that point on. Do we catch the similarities now? Between this journey to the bitter waters, and the wood was thrown into the bitter waters, it was a 3-day journey. Jesus was in the grave for 3 days, from that Friday to that Sunday morning. We find that he was laid on some wood, on a cross. And as he was laying or hanging on that cross, he said, I'm thirsty. I'm thirsty. Making me a bit emotional thinking about that. And he took that bitter wine. He took that bitter grape juice. That represented death. That represented what each single one of us deserves. It's what the Israelites deserved from their complaining all the way while God was doing miraculous stuff for them. They deserved to drink bitter water. But God changed that bitter water for them into sweet. And Jesus, while he was on that cross, he took that bitter water so we could experience the sweet. Today, this communion represents the sweet wine, because we no longer have to have that bitter wine that Jesus drank, because he drank that for us. So today, as we go out and we wash each other's feet, I want us to think of the water that cleanses. I want us to think of the water that washes. I want us to think of that purity that service brings. And I want us to come back, and as we partake of the bread and the wine, I want us to remind ourselves that Jesus was hung on that piece of wood so that you and I could partake of this service that he set up with his disciples just beforehand. So as we partake of that, may we think we really should be taking the bitter, but because of what Jesus has done, now we can have the sweet. And remember that he put this ordinance in place to test us, just like he tested them. Whether we believe what we're actually doing. Whether we believe that Jesus has cleansed us and made us whole. Let's think about that as we continue on this service. So I invite you to go out. We can go out this door or down the stairs and around the other way up into the hall for the ladies and couples who would like to wash each other's feet in the hall behind us. And the men, if they would like to, they can go downstairs. So I invite you to separate now as we remember these wonderful stories and what they mean for each one of us.